Sometime this past week, as I was in my car driving, I heard a commercial on the radio. Not one that was new to me. I'm sure I've heard it dozens or hundreds of times. But I don't know if you know how it is, being a preacher, and that motor in the back of your mind is just always running, always looking for things that are connecting with what you're going to be talking about and so forth. And well, this one didn't really connect, at least not initially, but it was one of those commercials that you come to the end and it said, brought to you by the Pennsylvania Lottery, please play responsibly. You've heard it too. Well, my mind did something different with that. I heard it, I knew what it was saying, I knew what it meant. The hope of getting a whole bunch for very little, the hope of suddenly becoming rich is just pretty enticing sometimes, and people gamble away all that they have and get nothing back. Please play responsibly. But of course, in my preacher mind, I'm thinking about the Lord's Prayer and this series that we're doing, and I'm thinking, that would be a nice slogan. Please pray responsibly. Well, what in the world could that mean? Well, then I started thinking, life is not a lottery. It may feel like it sometimes, but it's not really. What you do matters. There are consequences to our actions, and we may not be able to choose everything about our circumstances, but we can live out our lives with purpose, and that relates to our praying. Because as we've been studying these past several weeks, the Lord's Prayer was not given to us just to have words to say. No, we've called this series Living the Lord's Prayer. And what I believe Jesus had in mind when he gave us this prayer, this model prayer, was not just words to say, but was trying to shape our hearts. And there's something about a prayer that when we think more than just of the words that we're saying, when we think about the meaning of it, that the very prayer that we offer can shape our hearts. And we find that this prayer that Jesus gave us as a model, as an example, is filled with what I might call desires. Desires to internalize, desires to embrace, desires to then live out. The very first part of this prayer is very God-centered. Our Father who art in heaven, may your name be regarded as holy. May your name be recognized, acknowledged as holy. Oh, we can say those words, but when we begin to reflect more on that, and those words have a way of becoming desires that then shape our hearts, and if we are seeking to live out that prayer, then it's not just words, it's a desire, it's a longing of our heart that God would be recognized, would be honored. And as the prayer goes on to talk about the coming of his kingdom, we want to see that realized here on earth. We want to see his will done here on earth, even as it is in heaven. And you can't pray that long with deep feeling without starting to think about, okay, God, how can your will be done in my life? Not just the world out there, but how can that happen in my life? And you see how what we pray for can begin to work its way down and shape our hearts and guide us as we then seek to live that out, a God-centered life. We saw that too with the part of the prayer, give us this day our daily bread. Give us today what we need, and talked about how living that out calls us to a life of contentment. Not clamoring after things that will never satisfy, but trusting God, trusting our Father with the basic necessities of life. Seeking his honor first, just as that comes first in the prayer. The same way that Jesus said when he was in the Sermon on the Mount talking about all these things we worry about in life. Our food, our clothing, all of these worries. And said, no, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. Make that your heart's first longing, your greatest desire, your first priority. Seek that first and then trust God to provide what you need. Last week we looked at the part of the prayer that calls us to live forgiven and forgiving. Forgive us our debts, our trespasses, our sins, even as we forgive those who would sin against us. It's not just words. It's a direction of our heart to be lived out, even as we ask for God to make it so in our lives and in the world around us. And so we come today to lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Some translations deliver us from the evil one. How can we live out this part of the prayer? It's interesting, just the language of it kind of sounds like it's something we're making God's responsibility. God, I'm counting on you not to allow me to be placed in any kind of tempting situation. Okay, God, you got that? All right, that's your job. And now my job is to do whatever I want and trust you to keep temptation far from me. Well, that's not the model we've been looking at of as we're coming to God in prayer, as we're expressing what comes to be deeper desires in our heart, that we look for ways that God would want to work in and through us, that in essence we would partner with God as we make this our prayer. We talked a couple weeks ago about James in his New Testament letter, saying, what good is it, my friends, if you see someone who's in need and you say, oh, I hope you get everything you need. I hope you have food to eat. I hope you have clothes to wear. Have a good day. Is that really the longing of our heart, or is it just words? No, faith and actions come together, and if we're really sincere about it, we don't just say, oh, I hope this happens. Even as we're praying, even as we're saying, oh God, what can we do to meet the need of this person? Oh God, I'm concerned for this person. I want to bring their needs before you. Show me what you would have me to do. Now let's take that concept and place it here. Lead us not into temptation. So what's my role in that? There's a short autobiography I'd like to read for you this morning. Say, what? Autobiography, isn't that like a story of a person's entire life? Well, yeah, but this one only has 5 chapters. You can last that out this morning, can't you? Okay, it's called Autobiography in 5 Short Chapters. Still not sure if you're with me, are you? Okay. Well, these are really short. And I've shared it before. You'll recognize it. But let's listen to this through the lens of lead us not into temptation, and how do I live out that prayer? Chapter 1. I walk down the street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I fall in. I am lost. I am hopeless. It isn't my fault. It takes forever to find a way out. Chapter 2. That wasn't so bad, was it? Chapter 2, I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I pretend I don't see it. I fall in again. I can't believe I'm in this same place. But it isn't my fault. It still takes a long time to get out. Chapter 3, I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I see it there. I still fall in. It's a habit. But my eyes are open. I know where I am. It is my fault. I get out immediately. Chapter 4. I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I walk around it. Chapter 5. I walk down another street. Lead us not into temptation. How do we live that out? Well, what kind of temptation are we talking about anyhow? There a list of rules someplace? Is that what this is all about? Deliver us from evil? What's on that list? Tell me what it is so I can try to avoid those holes in the sidewalk, right? That's what this is all about, right? Well, yes and no. That is part of what this is all about. But I want to suggest that seeking to live out this prayer goes much deeper than that. In our call to worship this morning, we read of the promise that God gave through his prophet of making a new covenant with his people. He says, in those days I will put my instructions deep within them, and I will write them, that is the instructions, on their hearts. I want you to think about that for a moment. This is later in the Old Testament. Those of you who are reading through the Bible this year haven't come to this part yet. But boy, you've sure read through a whole lot of rules, haven't you? A whole lot of rules. And I want to suggest that when Christ taught us to pray, lead us not into temptation, he's not just thinking about all of these different hundreds and thousands of rules as little potholes to be avoided. I mean, that's a good outcome. And that's a good place to start. But I think he would call us deeper than that. It was the prophet Micah who wrestled with this question of what does God really want from us after all? And he's struggling with just all the sacrifices that we read about. And he says, "What will God be pleased with 1,000 rams, with thousands of rivers of oil? What does God really want?" And the answer doesn't come back with this big list of rules. He says, you know, God has already shown you what he wants, what he desires. Most of you know the rest of this. What God really wants is to do what's right, to do justice, to love mercy, to walk humbly with your God. See, suddenly that doesn't sound like a list of rules. Suddenly that sounds like a way to be. That sounds more like guiding principles that you follow them, and somehow that kind of makes the way clear as you're faced with all different kinds of circumstances and situations. It's not, oh, what's the rule for this? It's, what does justice mean in this situation? How can I love mercy here? How can I be humble before God today? Jesus put it in different words. When asked what the greatest of all the rules was, he said the greatest commandment is this: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength. The second, he says, is a lot like it. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. It says, on these two hang all the law and the prophets. Interesting. If you get these two right, if you get your heart right in relationship with God, if your heart, your desires are right in relationship with other people, then that becomes the principle out of which you live. And avoiding temptation is not just avoiding a list of rules. Avoiding temptation is whatever's going to draw my heart away from loving God first and foremost. Whatever's going to keep me from loving another person. You see the difference. You see the element of responsibility that falls on us to grow up. I don't mean to be harsh or unkind. We've talked about this before. We talked about how with our children, it starts out by giving them rules and we simply want them to obey, but that's not what we want for them forever. We want them to understand things like respect. We want them to understand principles of being safe. We want them to understand care and compassion for other people. We don't want them to be spending the rest of their life looking at the list of rules. We want them to be living out of a maturing faith, a maturing character that comes from in here. And I think that's what God is talking about when he says, I'm going to write my instructions deep on their heart. That's very different than just lead us not into temptation. It becomes our responsibility. Always dependent humbly upon God, yes. Our responsibility to seek to walk in right paths for his namesake. Now, I told you I'm always on the lookout for sermon material, for illustrations, for things that will make connections. And I had another one just this past, I guess it was week before last. And I want you to stick with me. This is going to be kind of an extended metaphor, perhaps, as I'm going to draw some analogies here. And maybe you've never been in this position before, but listen and imagine for a few moments. Most of you know that every once in a while I get myself involved in a theatrical production in a local theater. Usually once a year, maybe. And some of you know that I'm currently involved in one now. Well, just a week before last, I was involved in a conversation with a couple of members of the cast and the director of this particular production, and talking about just how a particular scene maybe was going to be acted, or I don't even remember all of the details of what specifically we were talking about, but the director made this statement. She said that sometimes when actors are saying, well, how should I do this? Or what should I do here? What should I do? She says sometimes she just wants to say to the actor, make a decision. Make a decision for your character. Okay, now let me back up a little bit, give you some context. Understand that in a play, there is a script to follow, okay? There are lines to learn. And then you have individuals who are trying to bring to life those lines, those words on a page, bring it to life and act it out in a believable fashion that contributes to telling a story. The director is the one who kind of stands back, kind of like directing an orchestra, directing a choir, and is trying to make sure that all the different individual parts are working together. That while something really important, like in a choir, is being sung, that these other parts over here aren't doing their own thing that's going to detract and distract from the person who's doing the important thing at the moment. Well, it's like that with the play as well. You have a story that's being told, and you need all the different actors doing their thing in a way that helps to tell that story. When you're in the middle of the scene, you know your lines, hopefully. You're focused on how you think maybe best you can portray that character, but you don't have the perspective that the director has, who's sitting out there, who's watching the whole thing in balance, who understands the story perhaps better than anyone else. And so, yes, there are times when the director is going to give some clear instruction and say, no, I think that'll be better if you say that over here. I think that'll be better if you do this. But ultimately, what the director hopes for in the process is that when opening night comes and you step out on that stage, that you're not just thinking about, okay, what did she say? What did she say? What did she tell me to do? Where did she tell me to walk? That as you're growing into that role, that you become to, you come to think like that character. And you become to understand that character, and you kind of become that character in ways that you know from in here. Aspects of what you need to do. And you're actually living it out from in here. And even as you try to grow in developing that character, and your desire is to do the best job that you can so that you can help tell the story in the best way that you can, there's still this, you can call it a dance, if you will, between trying and trying to think how this would feel if I was that person, and yet always looking to the director for feedback. This particular director, every rehearsal, every performance, she sends out an email with a list of notes, dozens and dozens of notes. Oh, that would be terrible, right? Well, no. I know several of us, the show is barely over for that night, and we're pulling out our phones to see what she wrote in the email. Oh, it's nice to hear, oh, that part was great. But if there's something that was off a little bit, we want to hear that too. Because we want to be able to improve it. We want to do the best we can to tell this story well. And I hope you're getting a little bit of a feel for, in a whole different arena of life, for the balance between just telling a director, hey, don't let me mess up. Don't let me ruin the story. Don't let me embarrass myself. Well, the director's going to do her part to help. But boy, there's a whole lot of it that falls on me. Not just remembering the clear instructions, but understanding the character and trying to live that out in a genuine and authentic way on stage for a few moments. Always open to feedback, always open to how can I do this better. You see how there's that cooperation there of trying to tell a story well. If actors can go to this great length to try to tell a story, how much more important is this principle in life? God is the director. He knows the end from the beginning. He knows the story, and He's written a part for you. Have you ever thought of the story of your life being lived out before the world? Have you ever thought of God, please don't let me mess up this story. God, help me to learn what you want for me. Help me to learn what my part in this story is, in your story. Help me to regularly be checking your notes at the end of every day, to be listening, to be reading your principles of living, to come to understand from the inside out so that it's part of my heart. And I'm not just trying to remember 1,000 rules, but I've come to know your heart. And when I don't have a rule for something I face, to have the confidence to make a choice. To make a choice out of justice and mercy and humility. To make a choice out of loving God and loving my neighbor. But all of it out of deep concern and a deep desire that my life tells the story of God and His grace and His love, that my life tells the story that God God called me to tell. And that by God's grace, I don't mess it up. And even when I miss a line, even when I miss an entrance, that somehow God would rewrite the story even as it's going on in ways that standing back up and getting back on stage becomes part of the story. And yet another reflection of His mercy and His grace in my life. You know, it's interesting. On stage, two different actors in the same role can bring out very different nuances in the same story. This particular show, there's a little girl involved, and we have two of them playing the role, not at the same time. Each one brings out a little different nuance of that character because we're all different. We're unique. And I want to suggest that in this story of life, that God's part for you, there's no one else who can play it just like you play it. And I hope this is sounding familiar because every once in a while I come back to this as our themes focus in on God's calling and our purpose in life, how that the way that God's love, let's view it as light kind of refracting through the lens of your life, the way that God's love can show through your life with all of its broken pieces, its successes, its failures, all of what it is, all of your passions, your gifts, your abilities, your past. The way God's love shines through all of that is different than anyone else's. And there are people who need to see the way it looks shining through you. Not just rules from a page, but touching us deeply. And then giving us courage to live out from that depth, from that reality, that genuineness. I love the refrain from Jason Gray's song, "With Every Act of Love." And this should sound familiar too, because I can't go too many months without reminding you of this too. God put a million doors in the world for His love to walk through. And one of those doors is you. Let's not be content to hastily pray through, "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." Let's think about what it means to seek to live a life that matters, that counts, to not mess up the story, to live out who God has called us to be, what God has called us to do, for His glory, for the good of the world around us.